welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens, and this is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. And today I have Carol Berg with me. I'm really excited to talk about different methods of plotting and discovery writing that maybe you haven't thought of. So Carol is a former software engineer, and she has written 18 novels and won the Colorado Book Award multiple times, in addition to the prestigious Mythopoeic Fantasy Award, which I associate with Tolkien. Obviously, I'm a big fan, so that's super exciting. Carol's latest fantasy adventure, A Summoning of Demons, arrived in 2021 from Tor Books under her assumed name of Cate Glass. And she also lives in Colorado, where it's kind of stormy and thundery right now. But welcome, Cate Berg. Or I'm sorry, Cate gets like a mashup name. Cate Glass,
that's
Carol
right.
Berg.
Yeah, anything. Yeah.
Welcome, Carol.
I answer to many things. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh yeah, it's my pleasure. When we met at the Pikes Peak Writing Conference, I had just a great time connecting with you, and so I'm glad that you agreed to be on the channel. So I was wondering first, how did you get into writing in the first place? You've been doing it for a while, and it seems like you must at some level really love it. So how did this all begin?
Well, it was something. I'm not one of these that started writing when I was 3, or it was my you know goal when I was 14 or anything. I did a whole lot of other things first, but I always was a reader, and I loved reading mystery. I read fantasy, I read science fiction, I love historical novels. I read everything, and I always did. And so what happened was that a friend of mine, when I was in the middle of my software engineering career, a friend of mine and I would go out to lunch, and we would talk about the books that we had been reading. And we both loved all similar kinds of books, and so we were on a fantasy reading binge, and we read a book that was written in the form of letters between two sisters, and it was a fantasy. It was kind of what I would call a fluffy fantasy. um, and so we talked about it, and my friend confided to me at that time, which I had never known, that she wanted to be a writer. And I said, I could never do that. I said, oh my gosh, you would have to learn to outline. You would have to learn to develop a plot. You would have to figure out symbolism, and you would have to figure out foreshadowing. And oh, that's just too much. I said, I like reading stories. And she said, well, I tell you what, she said, this book, that's these letters. Why don't we, I would really like to practice my writing, and why don't we try writing letters in character? If you would do that with me, then I could practice my writing, and it might be fun. And I said, well, so my kids were getting a little bit older at that time, needing a little less attention, and so I said, well, that would be kind of fun. And so all we agreed on was this is going to be a fantasy. It was going to be sort of a typical European setting, and that I was going to be the older sister and she was going to be the younger sister, and that I would write the first letter. I said, well, okay. So I went back to work that day, and at the end of the day, I said, well, okay, I'm going to start. And so I said, okay, dear Robin, her name was going to be Robin. And I started typing, and before I knew it, I had typed 20 pages, which I wish I could do now. I wish I could be as free as I was then, because I just wrote all sorts of things about how I ended up in this place, and these people that I was meeting, and all this stuff. And I sort of looked it over, and I said, well, this is pretty good. And so I didn't even have a printer at home. I spent all my days on a Unix workstation at Hewlett Packard. And I had kids at home, and I had books to read and other stuff to do. And I didn't do computer stuff at night or anything. So I printed it and took it home. And after, dinner and homework and kids in bed, and I sit down and I read it, and I go, ew. It was really purple prose. It was really wordy, which is a continuing problem of mine. And I started scribbling all over it. And so I took it back to work, and before the next morning, before I started, working on my project, I revised it, and I added a little more that night too, and a little bit more. I said, "Oh, this will be good." And so I looked it over and I said, "That's pretty good. Oh, that's a lot better. That's a lot better." And so at the end of the day, I did the same thing. I printed, took it home. After everything was quiet that night, I read it and I go, "Ew, it still needed work." But it was so much fun. I couldn't stop. And when I finally got, I mean, the letter format, it was interesting, but it's terrible because I immediately started putting in dialogue and
Mhm.
dramatization, because otherwise letter format is just telling. And so that's one of the things that bothered me. It was just, I was telling all this stuff, but I couldn't necessarily see it. And
Yeah.
so that was some of the lessons I learned. But over the period of a year and a half, we wrote each other about 32 letters each,
Oh,
and it
wow.
made a whole story. And we decided our styles were something like Dickens and Hemingway. Our styles were so different, because
So
if
you
we,
were
of
Dickens and
course,
she was
I was
Hemingway.
definitely Dickens, with lots of words and lots of characters and lots of descriptions.
Mm.
But it made a whole story, and it was so exciting. And during that year, we ended up we both lived in Colorado Springs at the time. And over a period of 6 months, she moved up to here to Fort Collins. Then I moved up. And so we resumed our lunches. But I wanted to start the sequel to that book, because of course it had a sequel. And
Of
so I
course.
started writing that, and I wrote that whole thing over about the next year. And then
Mm.
it got to where it squeezed out everything else I did except for my kids and my husband. I would go camping, and I would write in the tent, and I would write by the fire, and we would travel, and I would write. And yeah, I call it the hobby that ate my life, is what I call it.
Right. Sounds like the addiction, it was real
Oh,
from the
yeah.
moment when
Oh,
you
yeah.
decided to try it.
That's right. That's right. Mhm.
Well, that's interesting. I have not heard a story quite like that, but I love that it was you
Yeah,
and a friend, and it
yeah.
was just your love of reading that just kind of
Love of reading.
exploded into your own
And
works.
she was with me through every book, because we continued our lunches, and instead of
Mm.
talking about somebody else's book, we started talking about the books I was writing. And
Oh,
and
nice.
so yeah, so she was there really at the beginning of everyone, and she's the most perfect sounding board for your ideas, because I'll say, I've written myself into a hole and am right here and I don't know what to do. And she says, "Sure you do. You know what it is." And she said, "Well, what about this?" And I said, "Oh, no, no, it couldn't be that, because of this, this, this." She said, "See, you do know."
That's
So
actually the perfect segue to my next question, because it sounds like the examples that you've given so far, you're very much more on the discovery writer side of the spectrum. If you look at it as a spectrum from people who just meticulously plot to somebody who is a complete discovery writer, is that still the way that you write novels now, or is there some middle ground
no,
that you
not
find?
really. I never uh, never again did I ever start with a blank page and say, "Dear Robin," and start from there.
Hmm.
Because I do I what I figured out was that I had to know enough to write a scene before I started. So I needed to know when and where. I had my story ideas would come all every one of my story ideas since that beginning. And I did have a little bit. I knew we were sisters. I knew I was going to a castle and she was going to a magic school. I knew that much. Oh, and we had a mean uncle. He's the one who sent me to this castle. And so I knew something, but I didn't know very much. But every other one, it started with a character in a situation. What would it be like if you had been thrown into prison and kept there and told you had to be silent for 7 years, and you did not have any reason, any knowledge of why? And I start with that. And I knew who this person was. Um, and I knew that the story was going to begin when he got thrown out of prison, because while he was there, he never got any answers. And so he's essentially kicked out. And it turned out it was 17 years, as it turned out. And I put myself in the character's head. I know where I am, I know when I am, I know something that's got to happen. To me, that's a destination. That's not sitting down with a blank page. So I have, enough, I know enough to write a scene. And then I had an idea of the shape of the book. And that particular one, of course, by the end, he was going to know why. And I didn't even know why at the when I started writing, though. And so, but I did know that when he was thrown out of prison, um, his main focus was he didn't want to go back. And so I knew what he would be doing is trying to take himself. He was broken. He was, um, he couldn't play. He was a musician, and he couldn't. That was part of my setup, that he was a musician and something of a pacifist, and he had a power, that his music did something, and I knew what that was. And so I knew something, and I knew what was going to get him involved in finding out what had happened to him. And but mainly at first he just wanted to uh to hide, and he couldn't do that forever. So I know something, and so I don't put myself on this total discovery, oh, that everything's going to magically appear when I put my hands on. At that point I was still writing longhand and typing in, and I did that for up through probably my third published book. When I finally got a laptop and I didn't have to sit at a computer to write after I got home from being on a computer all day.
Right.
So, so anyway, yeah, so I put myself partway on that spectrum. There are certain things I have to know, and I have to know something about what I call the shape of the book, which is the overall story arc. Like, here's this person, he's going to solve this mystery, or here's this person who has no idea of his place in the world, and he can do magic, but he hates it, and he hates the restrictions that come with it. And at some point, he's going to find out what he's on this earth to do. And so I have that overarching story arc, but I just don't know the pieces that are in there. And so what I do is I write that first scene, and it generates questions. And that's what I do, because I think questioning is one of the best things an author can do. Always questioning your assumptions, your premises, your ideas. Is that really where is that logical at all? I really want this character to do this, and then this, and then this. How can I make them do it? Well, you can make them do anything, but you have to have a path of logic to follow in order for it to feel right to a reader.
Yeah, that's one of the major criticisms that complete discovery writers have of the staunch plotters, is that a story can feel disingenuous or false or something if everything is laid out in advance. But it seems like you found a way to kind of marry the two. So you have, is it fair to say that you have a through line, like the main question of the story kind of in mind as you're trying to get from the beginning to whatever the sounds like they're mostly character driven
Mhm.
aspects of the arc, is where that's going to go?
Um, I have something of a through line, but it can be very tenuous. It can really be, what is this person? And in that particular case where I had this, well, okay, I'll go back to a different one where I had this young man who's running away from his family. He's can do magic, but he hates it. He doesn't want to do it, and he's running away from his family. He's looking for his place in the world, and he wants it to be comfortable and warm, and maybe have a girl or a guy, either one. That'd be fine. He doesn't really want much. But in that particular situation, I knew a whole lot more about this world than I did when I started writing the one about the man who'd been in prison. I didn't know a lot about that world, but this one, because I had several ideas about the world that cropped up first. But then so my through line might be, yes, finding your place in this world that's riven by a small, an ice age, essentially, and a civil war. And the, and so his place has to be somewhere in that, but I didn't know quite where it was. Or another one where I started out where I had this image of a young, very good looking guy riding his horse across the steppes of Central Asia, desert, the sand rolling up behind him, and looking like the perfect heroic figure. But I said, but he's arrogant and entitled, and he's not worthy of some great destiny. I said, this looks like a man of destiny, and he's going to have a destiny, but I wasn't sure what it was, but he's not worthy of it because he's arrogant. He's just spoiled and arrogant and entitled. And I said, so he's going to have to be brought very low before he can be worthy of a great destiny. And as it turns out, that was an idea for a single book. But by the time I got to the end of the first book, I realized that I had gone in a totally different direction. Well, not a different direction, because he had changed, but he wasn't worthy of the destiny yet. And I still didn't know what it was. And it took me 2.5 books before I actually understood. Oh, I know. But I knew it was something great. So that's sort of a tenuous through line, but that was the shape of the story. And it was how he was going to get there and how he was going to navigate. Now what's going on? What's happening in this world that is going to help change him enough to be worthy of something heroic or noble? So yeah, different stories, but they have I have some shape to it, yes. And I know enough, and whether it's a month's worth of research or 5 days worth, or just an idea that's been noodling around in my head for half a year, I have enough to write a first scene.
Okay,
That's
that
the thing.
so your books sound like they're fascinating, not only because they're fantasy, and I love fantasy, but pretty large scale. There's a vast world, a lot of characters, a lot going on, and I personally I've done discovery writing, I've done plotting, I've done lots of things in between. I'm kind of all over the place, but the more characters I've really needed to keep track of, the more I've needed to have some way of keeping track of it all or planning more and that kind of thing. So, how do you keep track of your world building and your characters and all those threads so you don't drop any? It would be so easy to do.
Okay, so for one thing, um, I do write epic stories. It's about epic events happening, but I always do it through a very personal lens. This is what I say, is that I write epic adventures through a very personal lens. I have one or two first person narrators. All of my books are written in first person. They're all from this
Hmm.
very singular point of view. Or one series I have, this one's from one, this is from another, and this is from another, but they're all connected. But so I don't have the George R.R. Martin number of characters and things that I have to keep track of. And in my with my early books, I kept it all in my head. And but as I, got into my, fourth series, I discovered, oh, wait a minute, didn't I do that before? Didn't I have that person's name before? And I started keeping closer track. From the beginning, I always keep a timeline,
Hmm.
and I always keep a glossary. Those are the two most essential things that I've had. Every book, every series, I have a glossary because I do create my own world, and I've got 5 series, and they're set in, I mean, 6 series, and they're set in 5 different universes.
Wow.
Um, and so I do have to keep track of everything, and mostly it's those 2 things: a glossary and uh,
Timeline.
I keep maps. Yes, the glossary, the timeline, and I do keep I sketch a map. I'm not a great artist by any means, and so but I keep geographical data, how long it takes to get from this place to that place, and what's
Hmm.
their relative, and if the geography of the particular nation, some things are set in a little bit more narrow scape, but sometimes I need to know, these other city states, uh, and I might draw a map of those and say, okay, this is to the northeast, but it's sort of sketchy data. And then I do keep, and in my glossary, I always keep things like bits of language that I invent
I was
and
going to
what it
ask what
means.
belonged on your glossary. Is it the fictitious terms, or do you also have
Oh,
character names, place names?
I keep character names, place names, yeah, gods, goddesses, whatever. Most stories um not every series, but most of them, I usually have some notes about magic. I'll keep a file about how magic works, and I'll answer some of the essential questions. What are spells? Are there spells? Is it blood related? Is it all those wonderful questions? Because inventing magic is so much fun. I love it. So I do keep notes on that. And in some of the stories, the magic is um, extremely specific, and in some it's a little bit vague, or in that quite often it doesn't work right. I have one whole series that's constructed about a conflict between science, like if you think of the Age of Reason with Newton and Galileo, and the discovery of the circulation of the blood, and all those things that happen in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, 17th, 18th century, then it's such a wonderful time. And if you think, what if it wasn't magic, it wasn't science and established religion, but maybe it was science and magic that came into conflict, and something wasn't working in magic anymore, and what's happening to it. So I do that, but that's, it just depends, on the series, on the world, but I do like to keep fairly detailed notes, and this is all, things I keep in a file. But quite often I'll start a file on some aspect of the world, and then I use it at first, and then I sort of abandon it because I sort of incorporate it into myself, and I don't need to refer to it anymore. But glossary, I mean, I always do glossaries pretty carefully because I always put them up on my website, so that people can find them if they need, with pronunciations and stuff.
All right.
Um, but I don't have as complicated a world as George R. R. Martin might, um, or maybe even Tolkien. His wasn't so much because he was sort of easier to tell people apart. But anyway, I do keep track of things, and it's just, whatever you need, that you need to. Plot threads is a different matter. Um, the only time I ever really found myself detailing plot threads anywhere but in my head or in my manuscript, because I don't do individual chapters. I always keep one running manuscript.
Hmm.
And as I write questions down at the bottom. Um, between the current manuscript and the table of contents, so I can quickly go back to other chapters. Um, I always have a place where I keep, oh, well, if, okay, there's a rebellion, I might write, okay, who is leading the rebellion against the empire? And that I have to figure out. And then at some point I'll sit down and I'll say, oh, well, I understand this. And when I can answer them, I do, or that this one isn't relevant anymore because I've gone in a different direction.
Mm,
So, um, but that's what I do. I'll one time when it was really important that I keep track was when I have my double agent. So my Collegia Magica series, which is um, this one's set, and I have a sorcerer who's acting as a double agent, and so I have to keep track of the mystery of what is the truth about what happened in the events. What do the people who are uh, behind the conspiracy, what do they think is going on? And then what my investigator thinks is going on. And then what does his partner, who is the double agent, who seems like they're afraid he is actually being lured to the dark side. What is he really doing when he says, I'm doing this, this, this? And so I had to have a spreadsheet for that one where I had, okay, this is what is really happening. This, each one has a column, and then I had, oh, I make sure, well, we can't reveal, and then I would stick revelations in there as to when this is revealed and when this is revealed. So sometimes you
mm.
just have to adapt it to the story and figure out, so you can keep yourself straight with it. That's the main thing.
Mm.
Um,
So it's more like a need to know basis. Like you're the one who needs
yeah,
to know what is it that
yeah,
has
yeah,
to be there for the
yeah.
story to continue.
And I've
Yeah.
never found I know there are tools out there that can provide a lot of these continuity things. And I always thought, it's more trouble to install, maintain, learn, and adapt to, and then decide, oh, what if you don't like it? I said, I'm just gonna it's just record it somewhere. If there's something I need to know, I need to record it, and I'll just have a general notes file, or sometimes it's a journal. Right now I have this right here. This is where I'm holding information about the couple of projects that I'm working on now, and I'll scribble in that for a while I'm sort of working out plot ideas as I go, and then I tend to abandon it as I get deeper into the story. I just don't need it so much anymore because it's all here. That's why I can't work on multiple projects at once
Mm.
because I like to hold it all there ready.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one issue that I've run into and I've seen and heard people encounter when they write kind of like you do, where you're feeling things out, you're asking questions, you're um not going completely in the dark, but just like you described, is
Mhm.
that people can get bogged down in the middle and not actually reach the end, certainly not the level of satisfying ending that sometimes people who plot it out and plan it from the beginning can achieve. So what advice would you give for somebody who is stuck in the middle or unsure how to stick that landing when their style of writing is like yours?
Okay. Well, for one thing, you do have to step back and say, okay, where did I go astray? And what I will often do if I find myself, I'll start and then stop and start. I'll get to a place where I think I know where I'm going, but I get going and it doesn't feel right.
Hmm.
It's not leading anywhere. I find myself going in a circle. I say, okay, I need to step back, and I go and I start looking at decision points. Why did I have this happen? What is it that why can't I go forward? Well, maybe it's because something's out of order, or um, I just didn't have a clear enough idea about where I was going at. You have to have, every time you sit down to write a scene, you need to know where that scene is going. And or when you have a dialogue, and so you have a conversation, what do you want out of that dialogue? What is it supposed to accomplish? And I think sometimes we'll get all excited and we'll start writing and writing and writing and keep going, and we realize we haven't accomplished anything with the
Mm.
previous scene that we can build on to change direction. So I say go back to decision points. Sometimes that's the end of a scene. Sometimes it's where a character says, well, I'm just going to go and I'm going to go down to the river and I'm going to search for the guy. And you get down there and you say, oh, I've got to invent all these different people. And where is he looking at? And why do I care? You say, why do I care about this? What if he didn't go to the river? What if he said, oh, I need to do something else. I need to go kill a guy or whatever. Um, though my God, my women, my men, they don't often make that decision, but sometimes they think they're gonna, but they don't. But uh but I think that's one of the main things is you have to do some analysis. I did one time. I had these three female characters. They were all really important to the story. And I found myself as I was writing, I said, wait a minute, these, they're all identical. They're all well read, attractive, slender, very intelligent, and assertive. They're like, everything I always wanted to be, And I said, and they're exactly the same, but they serve
Mm.
very different functions in the story, as well as just being very different people from very different backgrounds. And so I sat down and I had to, again, I had to write it on paper, and I said, okay, this one, this one, this one. Well read. Well, she comes from a clan of people who don't read. Why does she have to be well read? She's well versed, she's well versed in society, and she knows a lot, and she does. Oh, she has to be assertive because she is the foil for my hero, who knows my hero to be, who is still sort of finding his way to be worthy of anything, and he certainly has to be worthy of her, and she has to be able to be an equal partner in that relationship, and she has to be able to throw stuff back at him. So and so I went back and I looked at the characters themselves. That you can say I invent characters on the fly. Well, you can, and sometimes it's the most delightful thing. Is you find you need somebody to go find the knife, and then and he's by the time you've written that little passage where he shows up, and then he shows up to my heroine, and yeah, and she talks to him and finds out a little about him, and he's so fun to write that later on she needs somebody to send a message or to take care of the horses, and she says, well, I can get this kid to do it because he doesn't have anybody else, and he really likes doing something useful. And then it turns out that he's one of the most important characters. By the time you get to the fourth book in the series, he's one of the most influential people, this quiet influence, because now he's 22, and he's your hero's best friend by that time. And you think that is true writer serendipity when you get that to happen. So, but anyway, you stop and you think and you make these people real people, because I don't sit down
Mm.
beforehand and make lists of characteristics, or this is what this kid who's finding that I need to find a knife, what is the overall wish of his life, even though we do find that out eventually. But that wasn't important in what he did. It was just his attitude, and it's, his circumstances, and then how he responded to my heroine's need. And so then you have to, at some point you have to think a little bit deeper, because you have to figure out, okay, how is this person going to act when she goes off on this adventure? Is he going to stay behind, or is he going to think, I'm already invested in this and she might need some help along the way. And maybe if I follow along and I'm just available, she doesn't have to know if she doesn't ever need me, but if she needs me, well, maybe I'm there. And so you think about that. And so you transform these placeholders into living, breathing human beings. And that's,
Mm.
again, that's one of the most delightful parts of being a writer.
So I'm hearing the kind of pieces of advice that people can take away are look back at the decision points, some of the more
Mhm.
recent decision points, and
Yes,
see what feels true to the character. And then I guess
yes,
it's not even really a second point, but just be curious about what the character would do next or
yes,
how they would go about
yeah.
getting, their needs or their
And
wants
why?
met.
Yeah, think about why they would even do this. Why are they even associated with your hero or your heroine? Why are they there? And that helps you, for one thing, it helps you find wonderful pieces of the plot that you might not have been able to plan out in advance. And
Mm.
I know people who plot do find these serendipity things along the way.
Right, hopefully people
And it
aren't
seems
hearing that
like,
from me either.
oh, no, no,
I
no.
found
And
plotting to be really useful for some
sure,
projects and discovery
sure,
writing to be better for others. So it's, this
absolutely.
is no knock on any plotters
No,
out there, but
no, no. I totally respect one of the most prolific writers I know. And she's a really excellent writer, and she writes down everything that's going to happen in beforehand, and that's how she's extremely successful. And I just can't do that. I just can't do it. I tried. I thought I was supposed to, and it doesn't happen. But I love being able to, uncover these things.
mm,
I know, okay, there's going to be a rebellion against this empire. And I think, who's the leader? And then I need somebody at some time. And this is what the things I'm writing at the bottom after I write the first scene and then the second scene. Okay, there's a rebellion going on. And there's somebody is going to be leading this. They're sort of outlaws right now. So I have somebody who's leading that. Who is it? And then I think, um, I had an idea of a character, just a woman who was involved with my hero's people, and that at some point during this war, when he was enslaved and taken away, she saw her mother murdered. And I just had this idea she would be a really interesting person to participate in this second part of this adventure. And I said, "Is she the leader of the outlaw band?" No, 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 no. She's much more orthodox in that. And then that leads me to think deeper about these, little character sketch glimmers that attach, that come on. And that, so I think about the needs of the story, and then I think about, oh, and who they are and how they will affect the story, because I love that interplay between the needs of the story, and then so I need someone to lead this outlaw band, but I want it to be somebody interesting and somebody who's not just a typical rebel. Oh, somebody who's kind of a pacifist who leads in a very different way. And
mm.
that's just fun. And I don't, for me, I can't think of all those things to start with. So
That I love it. It's nice to know that there are more people out there who have kind of like people like you who have this joyful, chaotic sort of process that still can lead to, books that are worthy of book awards and people truly loving these characters along with you. I think that's inspiring to a lot of people. So where can people find your books, find you, and everything Carol Berg online?
well, I'm on Facebook, and just as Carol Berg, and I'm always, happy to talk to different people. I I've done Instagram some, but I just kind of got bored with it. Um, but I'm there occasionally, and I admire people who can do all of those things. My books can all be found on Amazon. They can all be found. Most online booksellers. Finding my books in brick and mortar stores is getting harder and harder. Except for my last three books are the Cate Glass books, the Chimera series, and you can still find those in bookstores at times, and they're certainly orderable in bookstores. My other books are, um, they still, they still sell and people still love them, but you can find them all certainly online. Um, and you can also, if you go to my website and sign up for my newsletter, I do send out a newsletter um, at least a couple of times a year. This is not something I do every month. And I also host online readings. So if you are in my newsletter, I will say, okay, we're going to do our autumn Zoom reading on Thursday night at 6 o'clock Mountain Time. And, I have people come from the UK who stay up till 1 o'clock and
Oh,
join
wow.
me, but it's really fun. And I let them vote on what they would like me to read from, whether
Mm.
something, that I'm working on, which is kind of frustrating sometimes because I haven't finished it yet. But some people like to hear that, and some people like to hear, their favorite passages from, or something from, some of my earlier work or whatever. So it's usually about an hour, hour and a half that we end up hanging around and answering questions and stuff like that. But that way you access that through my newsletter. Um, so that's a really fun thing. I wish I'd started it years ago. But the pandemic has done some good things for us, because like here we are on Zoom and doing all this stuff that it's really pretty easy now. And I'd love to do readings when I go to conventions. I also attend conventions. I am a regular attendee at Mile High Con here in Denver. I most years I go to Norwest Con, which is in Seattle in the
Hmm.
spring. I often go to the World Fantasy Convention, though again, the pandemic sort of interrupted that. I had a string of, where I'd gone since the year 2000 was when I went to the first one, was in 2000. And I often go to the World Fantasy Convention, which sort of moves around, but it's usually in end of October, first weekend in November. But I always keep a list of the places I'm going to be um, on my website, which is just carolberg.com. Um, I love doing writers conferences like Pikes Peak, where we met. Uh, I love teaching at writers, and I'm going to be teaching at Colorado Gold Writers Conference in September this year, and I do that a lot of years. So those are two places where I regularly um, or semi-regularly teach, because they don't have the same things every year. But anyway, that's where I can be found. It's all on my website or my newsletter. You can find out where I'll be. And I love meeting readers in person. That's one of
Mm.
the best things that, when I go to Seattle and I have, people that have read my books, and we come and we have lunch and we have a drink or have, a cup of tea in the afternoon, whatever. I think that's just one of the best things. And
Oh,
Zoom
that
is pretty
sounds.
good. Everybody has to bring their own drink when we have our Zoom reading, but
Yeah, a little less travel involved.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to me and really get into your plotting, writing, not plotting
You can tell I
process.
hate talking about it. I just hate talking about writing. You dragged me here,
Yeah, well,
forcing me
I have an entire YouTube channel, so I hate it too.
here. Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I will let you go. Make sure to check out the notes below. I'll leave all the links that Carol talked about down there. Don't forget to subscribe for more writing, publishing, and indie author life, and I'll see you next week. Bye.